Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Khadijah Matin, and as an ordained interfaith minister whose core faith is Islam, I've had a journey. And I'm this opportunity to share with you my journey. I certainly want to thank everyone who's made this possible, especially Sheikh al-rawiya, who through her courses, through the Sheikh Fest, through the developing friendship, she's opening more and more opportunities for women of Islam to share, to be educated, and to just enjoy the joy of Islam. As an African American woman, I come from a family whose origins are in the Midwest. Yes, there are African Americans in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Colorado. Those are places for generations my family has called home, including Buxton, Ontario, Canada, parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, some through the Trail of Tears, others always being freeborn, a twice great-grandfather who was an Irish Quaker. But the thing that has run through my family's history has been elements of faith, elements of social justice that we'd call today, or what we used to call, we were race people. We were people who taught, nurtured, and tried to lead. We were people who had in our hearts, even as we struggled and dared to do more, we had in our hearts that element of faith that just makes things seem possible. As a teenager, I was in Brooklyn, New York. My dad worked for the VA, so we were a very middle-class family in Brooklyn. But we were a family where on at least one Saturday a month, my family would have these soirees in the house where prominent African Americans and civil rights activists and social justice people and clergy and doctors and dentists would come and debate and would talk and would share. But on Sunday, we went to an Episcopal church. We were a prominent family in that church. And so it was very important, Sunday school, understanding the Bible, and participating in the church services. So as we went to school every day, we went to church on Sundays, but we were expected to read. In our living room, there were encyclopedias, cyclopedias, books. We read all the daily newspapers, Look magazine, Ebony magazine, whatever was there. My father encouraged us to read and to explore. It was understood that, yes, you'll learn how to work with your hands. So even the girls in the family, we knew how to lay tile and flash the roof, just like our brothers did. But we were also told, though you may wear a blue collar maybe in your life, you also need to understand how to wear the white collar. You need to know how to read things very deeply. So in high school, I had the opportunity to participate in an interfaith studies class. It was called, I think, Religions of the World. And I was very grounded in my Christian beliefs as an Episcopalian. And I found it fascinating to read about the Buddhist and the Hindu and this religion called Islam. So I took this class in high school about the religions of the world, and I began to read the texts. And I thought it was just absolutely fascinating. But what kept bringing me back to was this almost like a whispering in my heart or in my ears. And I must have been about 13 years old. And I went to the minister of my Episcopal church and I told him, because I was finishing my confirmation classes, and I went to him and I said, I have been called to preach. In the 60s, this wasn't heard of. He called my father in uproar. How could she have gone through confirmation? How could she have been baptized and think that she could teach and preach as a woman? Made sense to me, made sense to my parents as well. And so I was encouraged and I joined a congregational church. They had a lay ministry for adolescents. The minister of the church at the time, it was, part of the time of the Vietnam War. The Civil Rights Act had just been passed. Title VII had just been passed in 1964 and 1965. We knew that we had another way in which to live, that we were entitled to quality education, good health care, decent housing. There were elected officials emerging in my community like Shirley Chisholm. So I knew that there were some things that were possible. And so I preached one Sunday a month at this congregational church. And I read a version of the Bible that was in everyday English, which made it a whole lot easier. And that's when I began to discover that there were more translations of the Bible other than the King James Version. And I began to then be able to embrace the message of the Bible. So my Christian belief, it was solid and it was grounded. However, my ability to listen to others was expanding at the same time. It meant, in terms of my social crowd, I was on the edge. Some of my friends used to say to me, "You're different. You're changing. What's up with you?" At the same time, I belonged to a high school sorority. I was a leader in that sorority. We had, as a tenet of the sorority membership, was that you had to volunteer, you had to provide service. And so one of the things I did was volunteer in what we used to call those days an old folks home. And I was working with older women who all they wanted to do was, they would say, "Well, baby, I just want to read the Bible to my grandbaby." And so I was helping them learn how to read through reading them sections of the Bible. Well, the more I read, the more I needed to know more. And so eventually, as I went to college, I went to a Jesuit college and had excellent professors. And one of them was a Muslim from Egypt, who, as we learned about Islam, at the end of the class, gave me a copy of the Quran that he had been given the year I was born. And he said, "You should have this." And so I read. And so my first reading of the Quran in its entirety was a Pickthall translation. And I was amazed. And what it said to me was that Islam was not Christian, not Jewish. It was a continuing of this conversation. What I felt in my heart was that God had given me an opportunity to continue my relationship with him. I understood that the Bible was not the Old Testament and the New Testament, but it was the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. And that Allah was talking to me the whole time. And I began to feel more and more that it wasn't that I was leaving my church, or like some woman said to me, "Girl, you giving up your Jesus." No, I didn't give up my Jesus. I began to see him as the prophet Jesus, and I began to have a conversation with him too. And then Moses became more real to me. Abraham was crystal clear. What was that struggle about? What was the story about? Ishmael, Yusuf, all of them. It was this relationship. And when I read the chapter on women, Nisa, and I read it, and I even tugged with some of the translations, I went and found more. And I began to see that even if something that someone would interpret for me as it from a very male-centric perspective, but I said, but God is bigger than that. So I'm going to go with the assumption that it wasn't a narrow understanding that I needed to follow. Eventually, by the time I was 18, I had taken Shahada. I had accepted Islam. Some people thought I lost my mind. Some people thought I found it. What I did discover was that I was at a point where a lot of things were changing, but that I was doing the right thing, and it meant a tremendous sacrifice. I lost a job I had. I lost a lot of friends. I lost a lot of things that I assumed to be an integral part of my life. So I continued, and then I was confronting levels of racism in some of the masjids. And so then I eventually joined the Nation of Islam thinking, well, there's black folks. How bad can it be? And it served a good purpose. It helped me. I moved up in position of leadership because I'd had a few years of college. I used to write for Muhammad Speaks. I was part of the women's group and led a lot of activities with that. I became a secretary in the executive suite of offices in New York. And I eventually met the man who would be the father of my children as he managed the Salam restaurant. And it was an arranged marriage. And though our marriage only lasted 10 years, we believe that Allah wanted us to come together because our 3 children are people who are contributing in a very significant way to society and to our understanding as our roles as caliphas or stewards of the earth. Sometimes we're called to serve and sometimes we just don't even understand why. But even though our marriage only lasted 10 years, the friendship has endured. And even as he married and had other 3 children, we raised all 6 children very closely because we believed that as we had Allah at our wedding, we brought him to the divorce. And in doing that, we said, what are our ethics? What are our values? What's the morals? What comes to us through our Islam? And it meant that we did not raise these children as stepchildren. We raised them as brothers and sisters. And I think if I have not done anything else in this world, that to me is the most outstanding thing that I was able to accomplish. Is that there is these 6 adults who work hard, who have advanced degrees, who are doing stellar work, who call me mommy. I can't think of a better title than that, especially when they turn to me and ask me for advice. When the young people in the community come to me, and as I settle into this role of elder. But it wasn't always a smooth journey. Because as I got my divorce, there were some in the masjid that I attended who began to reject me because they thought I would want their husband. So some sisters, they stopped inviting me to their house because, oh, my husband might notice you. I was gorgeous. Is that my problem? I have good ancestors, okay? So they resented that. And I used to cover my hair all the time. And then I couldn't get a new job. And there was a time where the children's father was ill. We were struggling. There was much sacrifice. My father had passed away. His mother had passed away. Our anchors weren't there. And so I began to not question my faith, but I began to understand that I need to be solid in what I need to do. And so just like my grandmother, who as a homesteader would go out and pull the plow on her back and plow her 60 acres before she went to teach in her one-room schoolhouse, because her husband was fighting in France during World War I. So just as my grandmother knew what she had to do, I knew what I had to do. And so I stopped covering my hair, and within 2 days, I had a job. But I did not forget the core elements of who we were as a family, what was our faith, and what was our understanding. The children began to get a balance. They had a stepmother who was a bit more orthodox. They had their father who was very grounded, very deep in his faith and understanding, but very compassionate, very balanced. And they had me, like a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll. The result was the children understood that there's this element of love and joy and compassion and having faith. We saw how some people raised their kids in these very stringent boxes. And when those kids broke out of their box, it was all over. And we didn't want that for our children. We wanted our children to be able to walk in any room, in any road, on any house, anywhere in the world, and be clear about who they were. Historically, what's our genealogical history? What's our social history? And so we made sure that they understood who we were in terms of race and class and social justice. Well, life continued. I had ups and downs. I had fat moments and skinny moments. I had moments where health was challenged. However, I continued to be part of the local and then eventually the national conversation about nonprofit organizations, about community empowerment, about women empowerment. And I began to counsel and coach and nurture and guide families about how to be stronger within a social justice context. People, regardless of their faith, would come to me. Muslim sisters would sneak to me. Brothers would tell them, Astaghfirullah, don't go to her. She's terrible. She's evil. She's all these things. And Allah blessed me every single day to continue to be the person that I am. And He enabled me to find a way every day. There were days I didn't know, how am I going to get to work the next day? How are the children going to eat this week? And every morning a blessing would arrive. It didn't mean we didn't plan. You know, life has its struggles. We endured, but we endured with a kind of joy. We endured with the sense of what's possible. And this is what Islam helped me to never lose sight of. The capacity to continue to grow as a human being because we understood that as stewards of the earth, how do we leave it better than when we arrived? How do I do today better than I did yesterday? And so it wasn't just about empowering other women by telling them how to be themselves. It was meeting them where they were and helping them move forward. And for every woman and man that I helped and coached and every family I guided and counseled, I then would go home with the same lesson and figure it out. And it was learning how to be neighbor. I remember there was an elderly woman who was locked out of her apartment, and I noticed she was standing in the hallway. So I offered her a chair, and I said, do you need to use the restroom? And so I allowed her to use the bathroom. I put the chair in the hallway so her son could see her. And I sat with her. I sat on the stairs in the hallway, and I just chatted with her while my kids did their homework nearby. Every day for the next year, she would knock on my door and see, how am I doing? And somehow or another, she would know the day that I didn't quite have enough money for dinner. And she would knock on the door, and she would hand me a pot of food. And she'd say, here, daughter, eat. To me, Allah sees what we do. Allah sees what we need. It is written long before we even know. And so we wonder, how does she know? Allah sent her long before I knew. And I endured. And eventually my family prospered, and my children went to college, and I had a little bit more freedom, and I began to question more and change friendships and change relationships. And for a minute thought, well, I could be over here, and I began to journey and explore, and I looked at other faiths and I said, no, it's good to know that they exist. It's good to know and understand them. It's good to know the people who practice them because they're part of the community. But I am still a Muslim. And people would say to me, well, you don't look like a Muslim. And I would say, then this is an opportunity for you to expand your sense of what other is. And other is not really all that other after all. You know, people would challenge me all the time. Muslims would challenge me and non-Muslims would challenge me. People want you to look and act a certain way as if that's the only way that's possible. But that can't be the only way possible. Look at all the different ways that we exist in the world. So I continued and I persevered. And eventually, I was invited by a friend to attend an open house at One Spirit Interfaith. And it was at a time where, you know, I was settled in a pretty good job at a teaching hospital, and I was coaching and counseling staff. But I knew I needed just more. I had not remarried. I was feeling like there was a gap because there's nothing like companionship. But it wasn't just, oh, I got to have a man in my life. I needed something more. After going to the open house, I said, here's a place where I could be a Muslim and still be in conversation with a broader community. Here's a place where I would not be challenged because I dressed in a different style. Here's a place where I could question safely, where I could read and wonder and ponder and not be told, oh, sister, you're questioning your faith. Your faith isn't strong. If you were a true Muslim, you wouldn't even need to ask the question. Not so. All right. From what I understood, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he encouraged the conversation. Where did our hadith come from if it had not been for somebody coming with a question? Allah keeps sending us all these different messengers because we sometimes need to get the lesson a lot of different times. And so I studied, and at one spirit, I met extraordinary people. At one spirit, I was able to really get into my groove as a scholar and someone who likes to read and write very deeply in terms of faith. I could hear the calling coming back. I could almost hear Allah say, I called you when you were 13. I let you teach. I let you organize. I let you do other things. But I'm calling you again. And this time, I didn't have to ask permission of anybody. This time, I stepped up. Scared, apprehensive, sometimes wondering. But the joy, I remember when we took our vows to be ordained as interfaith ministers. I couldn't hear. I was having problems with my hearing. I couldn't hear. And so I had to trust that when the leader of the organization read the vows of ordination, I had to trust that what she was saying was what I was committing to. And so I accepted. And I knew the vows that I had written. And I knew the commitment that I had made. And I knew the prayers that I had asked God. I had asked Allah, please help me to find how I should serve. Please help me find the joy and the love again. Please open my heart to love again. And my body began to hurt less. My attitude softened. My ability to be compassionate to the next person emerged even greater. My writing, I went back to writing in a depth and a richness that it was not about, this is Khadijah and this is her ego. It was about, and when someone reads this, how will I help them to learn? My job, they said, what happened to you? It's like a whole new person has emerged. The relationships with my children, the conversations we had, I was no longer their mother. I was their companion to journey with them in their maturity. With the children's father, we were able to understand why we had become friends. We discovered that our families actually knew each other before. We discovered that our families had similar history before, that we had come from generations of cattle ranchers and teachers and ministers. We understood that Allah knew best. And so we understood then, and I went back to his family reunion, and the family embraced me because they felt like I was the lost daughter. And I opened up to an understanding of love, that it may serve in one way and it will continue to grow. And so I continued to study. And through the encouragement of a dear friend, I then pursued and entered into the spiritual counseling program at One Spirit. And while I was doing that, that same dear friend had another idea and suggested, rather insisted, that I participate in a doctoral program, a multi-faith program in New York Theological Seminary. It wasn't like I had a choice. She told them that I was going to come attend, and she told them what September I was going to attend. So when they called me and said, where's your application? I had like 5 days to get it in. And this is when, again, you know that Allah is sitting there right with you the whole time. I wrote my heart out. I go back and read some of that sometimes and I go, who wrote that? Did I write that? Allah holds the pen and he writes it. And so I too received a certificate in interspiritual counseling, and I too have a doctorate of ministry from New York Theological Seminary. I 2. I was the third Muslim woman to receive that doctorate. 3. In 2012. It says there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But then, you know, my work expanded. I now do coaching on the job with staff, and particularly with medical staff, and the Muslims come to me, and a lot of different people come to me for advice, for counseling, for direction. I continue to be a significant role player in other major national nonprofit organizations. And I have children who have partnerships and marriages, and I have grandchildren, and life is just expanding. And I said, I want to learn some more. I was reminded of my interest in Islamic jurisprudence, and I was reminded that it's really jurisprudence, and that, you know, there's a deeper way of reading the Quran. It's not just about, can I read the whole Quran during the month of Ramadan? I have not been able to fast for Ramadan because of my arthritis, so I was sometimes feeling guilty. Well, 3 Ramadans ago, while I was wondering, am I going to be able to get through this month, not able to fast, but how do I help others? I woke up 2 o'clock one morning in tears, and I could almost hear a voice saying, my daughter, you are loved. The blessing that came to me that Ramadan was like something I have never experienced. The depth of my faith just rose up. And I understood I'm right where I should be. I'm right how I should be. And that I am fully accepted in the eyes of God. So what has really come up? Understanding that Ramadan where I'm so feeling accepted. So many opportunities and relationships and friendships began to just open up. Who I knew, who I was able to build bridges with, the kind of work I was able to do, even the quality and element of what I was doing on a job that I've now been on for almost 15 years. The title hadn't changed. The substance of the work had. How I was recognized in the communities has changed, not because, oh, well, she is this thing, but my work was showing out. My works were coming out. And so I understood then I need to know more. I need to go back and read the Quran again. I need to be in conversation with the Quran. So part of my doctoral dissertation, it contained a reading of sacred texts. It also contained a novella where I tried to create what would have been the journals of my paternal grandfather, who was born in 1867 and died in 1916. But in Omaha, he was known as the Black Councilman of Omaha. And he was known as a race man. And he was also a man of faith, very active in a lot of organizations, was a Mason, attended church, first an AME and then a Baptist church. But I needed to know who he was. I had heard about him. My dad had talked about him. And I saw elements of what my dad did in his life were the result of this father who died when my father was 5 years old. As I read 200 books to understand how an African American man born at the end of slavery could make such a significant difference in hundreds of people's lives, because he convinced the state of Nebraska to expand the opening of the Kincaid Act to allow more African Americans to homestead in Nebraska. Why am I talking about this? Because the more I dug into what his life could have been, the more I began to dream. And it was almost like the ancestors had been sitting back and waiting for me to finally call them. And I found snippets of sermons that prior ancestors had written. I found essays where they were recognized for things. I found all kinds of things, and I began to see that my grandfather's transformation from a young man who went to a freedmen's school and thought that he would be a store clerk, becoming a significant politician in the state of Nebraska. To this day, he is still recognized. I knew then that there was something that I needed to get deeper into, and it helped me understand. He knew his faith. My grandmother knew her faith. My other aunts and uncles who were the first in their areas knew their faith. They knew their Bible. Well, then I needed to know my Quran. And so I began to attend classes, some at the Islamic Center at NYU. I began to have discussions. I began to collect different translations of the Quran and would pick a chapter and just read different ones. And so I began to draft this workbook, a segment of which is in my doctoral dissertation, where I take the names of Allah, the 99 names of Allah, and I explore them in depth, reading the name, reading what the meaning is, then looking for other sacred readings and writings that will also manifest the same message that Allah wants us to get. If I'm saying, al-Matin or any of the other names, what is it? What is the message that Allah wants us to get? Why do we get a richness from reading that? The process of doing that then also meant that I needed to read more. And one of the opportunities that emerged was that I got to go to this Shaker Fest. And I was a bit apprehensive at first because known by some as that rebellious Muslim sister, or, that's Khadijah and that's just her way. But my mom used to say that too, and my dad did too, so I didn't take it as an insult. But that's Khadijah and that's just her way. But I wanted to go because I also like the community of sisterhood. Congregation is an integral part of Islam, whether we're making prayer or having dinner. When the coming together of the believers is an enrichment of the heart. And so I went to this Shaker Fest with my good friend, the one who has nagged me regularly to attend school programs and other events. And we went out in the middle of Jersey. We thought we'd never get there. And we wondered, who were these women? And we heard this extraordinary speaker, Shaker Rayma. And she spoke in a way that my heart said, boom, because she heard us. She heard the struggle we had gone through. Those of us as African American women who had become Muslims, who did not fit a preconceived notion of what you should be, but tried to be authentic to ourselves in the eyes of Allah. She spoke in such a way, and here was a sister who was a Shaker. Now you have to understand, just 3 weeks prior, a brother had said to me, Sister Khadijah, how come you don't identify yourself as a Shaker? Based on all the scholarship that you have under your belt, you need to give yourself more credit. And I was a bit apprehensive because I'm not fluent in Arabic. I didn't study in a foreign country. All the standards that the Muslim brothers would tell me over the years, if you don't study in Egypt or if you don't study here or there, it doesn't count. You're not really, and we won't really let you sisters do that. You need to just stay in your place. And this Shaker Fest challenged a lot of that. And then after attending that, became aware of the opportunity for this online study. I was like, are you serious? So I took my next to the last $100 before payday, and I enrolled in this course because I figured I'm doing this. And it was one of the best things I could have done. The level of scholarship, the structure of the program, the consistency, and then of course, these surprise quizzes where you only get to take them one time. So in other words, a clear message that you will ethically and morally and appropriately do this study. And you better be paying attention because you can only take the quiz one time. So that means that you listen to the video and you read the study notes and you study them. And what really happens is you send your ego on vacation. So what I found to be very exciting was here I'm hearing this shaker at this Shaker Fest. And just a few weeks prior, I was challenged by a brother saying, Sister Khadijah, with all that you've done and all the work that you've done, how come you're not calling yourself a shaker? And I was a bit reticent about doing that because for so many years you're told if you don't study at this school or that school, and if you're not a man, then you really don't have that opportunity. And so it was kind of like, can I use this? Do I feel comfortable with this? I was just beginning to get comfortable with even calling myself doctor. The challenge continues, but more and more I'm being recognized or identified. Either I will be addressed in a Muslim conference or organization as the Reverend Doctor and respected for that, because there's a broader understanding that when someone takes a vow of being a reverend, it doesn't mean that they're a priest, a Catholic priest or a Christian priest. It means that they have taken a commitment and a vow to serve. They have done a body of study and they have taken this vow to serve. And as a doctorate, it means they've taken a level of academic study to further that ministry. Recently, I was recognized, someone tried to use all the titles, and I said, Reverend Shaker Doctor. I said, the line isn't long enough. But what really became clear was I took that as a message from Allah that I need to continue to study, to be the quality of my work. And as I've continued doing with the online study, it's become much, much richer. So I completed the first module. I got through understanding a lot of the background. It made the Quran a little more personal. I began to have this exchange with it. And so I completed it. It was a very rigorous study. I highly recommend it to anyone, Muslim or not, because the way the information is presented, it really gives you what is this body of work and what is the relationship within the Abrahamic traditions and faiths, and what does it mean historically and globally, but not from a perspective that can oppress, but rather from the perspective that I think it was intended by the Prophet, peace be upon him, that what we do through these teachings is how we then further service to humanity and expand the definition of justice in a way that enriches the lives, addresses the challenges of poverty and the various isms that put us in boxes and cause warfare and misunderstanding. The key thing about Islam for me is what is the nature of the relationship I have with Allah, and how then is that manifest in the nature of the relationships I have with my family, with my community, and with the global community at large. In taking the second module, I'm beginning to now get into a very deeper understanding of tasfir. And though some of the interpretations and readings by some in the past, because they're a bit historical, are actually the ones that I get most excited about. Because when I understand the historical context in which something is written, I'm then able to understand how it relates to me today. You know, Dr. Sherman Jackson said a few years ago that the capacity of Islam is that it expands. For each generation, we've been able to see and understand how it serves our heart, and how when we read the beginning of each chapter, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the compassion, the mercifulness of Allah, we then see how then do we manifest this in our lives each day? Where does the openness for it comes? So in doing the deeper reading, it gives me a better sense. For this person that I'm serving or counseling, I may have to come from this perspective. For this person, I may have to listen from their perspective first, so I can understand how to help them walk that bridge to freedom. You know, civil rights wasn't just about 1964 and 1965. Civil rights has been about the eternity of humanity. Civil rights has been about how did Allah help us to be created, to understand, and to serve. For each hundreds of years, he brought a different teacher in the same message, slightly different form, maybe a different container, but certainly the same message, the oneness of Allah. And that if we see and understand that oneness of Allah, then we understand, well, the other is not so other after all. And what this has done through these online courses, through deeper study, through expanding the neighborhood of people that I work with, reaching out and getting to know people that I don't normally see on a daily basis, it helps me as a woman grow, understand, and mature with the compassion and grace and mercy of Allah. This has been truly an extraordinary experience. I look forward to seeing where I go next. I give thanks for this opportunity of sharing, and I hope that what I share has brought you closer to an understanding that the love that Allah has for us is already in our hearts. We just need to be open to it. Assalamu alaikum.